The door of the bookshop burst open before Evelyn Hart could turn the lock, and a tall man in a rain-soaked coat stepped inside, breathing hard, his eyes wild with something close to panic. Thunder cracked outside, rattling the windows, and for a moment, Evelyn thought a thief had come to rob her. She grabbed the brass candlestick from the counter and held it up like a weapon. "Stay back," she said, her voice steady even though her heart was pounding. The man raised both hands. "I am not here to hurt you," he said quickly. "I need your help. I need it tonight." Evelyn did not lower the candlestick. She studied him. His coat was expensive, though torn at the shoulder from running through the storm. His boots were polished but muddy, and his face, despite the fear in it, was one she recognized from the newspapers. Duke Alexander Winslow, the richest and most talked-about man in the county, standing in her tiny shop at 9 in the evening, looking like a man being chased by ghosts. "You are the Duke," she said slowly. "And you are Mrs. Hart," he answered, "widow of Daniel Hart, owner of this shop. I know who you are, because I have spent the last 3 days finding you." Evelyn's stomach tightened. Why would a duke spend 3 days looking for a widow who sold books for a living? Why would he arrive soaked and desperate at closing time, glancing over his shoulder as if the street itself might swallow him? "What do you want?" she asked. Alexander stepped further into the shop, his eyes darting to the door behind him, as though he expected someone to follow. "My grandmother is dying," he said. "The doctors say she has weeks left, maybe less. Her last wish, the only thing keeping her holding on, is to see me married before she passes. She has said it every day for a month. She will not rest until she sees my wife with her own eyes." Evelyn frowned. "Then find a wife. Surely there are 100 women who would marry a duke tomorrow if you asked." "That is exactly the problem," he said, his voice dropping. "Every woman who says yes to me says yes to my title, my money, my house. My grandmother is sick, not foolish. She would see through any of them in a single conversation. She needs someone real, someone who does not want anything from me, someone who could convince her, even for a short time, that I am loved for who I am, and not what I own." "And you think that person is me?" Evelyn said, lowering the candlestick slightly. "I think," Alexander said, choosing his words carefully, "that you are a woman who has already loved and lost, who understands grief, who does not care about titles because you have survived without needing one. I think you are the only person who could walk into my grandmother's room and make her believe, if only for a little while, that I am finally happy." Evelyn set the candlestick down on the counter, though her hand still trembled. "You want me to pretend to be your wife? For 6 months," he said. "That is all I am asking. 6 months of pretending, in exchange for enough money to save this shop, pay off every debt your husband left behind, and give you a future that does not depend on how many books you sell each week. I know about the eviction notice, Mrs. Hart. I know the landlord has given you until the end of the month." Evelyn's face went pale. "How do you know that?" "I told you," he said. "I have spent 3 days finding you. I needed to know I was asking the right person." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Rain hammered against the windows. The shop, usually Evelyn's quiet refuge from the world, suddenly felt small and airless, as if the walls themselves were leaning in to listen. "This is madness," Evelyn finally said. "I do not know you. I cannot simply move into a stranger's house and pretend to be his wife in front of his family, his staff, his entire world. What happens when someone realizes the truth? What happens to my reputation? What happens if your grandmother discovers the lie and it breaks her heart instead of healing it?" "No one will discover it," Alexander said, stepping closer. "I will make certain of that. You will have your own room. Your privacy will be respected completely, and every part of this arrangement will be handled with total decency. I am not a man without honor, Mrs. Hart. Whatever else I might be tonight, desperate and soaked through with rain." Evelyn crossed her arms, trying to steady the storm of thoughts inside her. 2 years had passed since Daniel's sudden death. 2 years of quiet grief and slowly crumbling finances. 2 years of pretending to customers that everything was fine, while she counted coins late at night to see if she could afford both rent and food. The eviction notice sat folded in her desk drawer, a countdown she had been trying not to think about. "And if I say no," she asked, "then I will thank you for your time, and I will leave, and I will find another way to give my grandmother peace before she dies." Alexander said, "But I came to you first, because I believe you are the only one who could do this, with honesty in her heart, even if the situation itself is not honest." Evelyn looked past him, out the rain-streaked window, at the dark street where her whole life had narrowed down to a single small shop that might not even be hers in a few weeks. She thought of Daniel, of the laugh he used to have, of the plans they had made that death had erased in a single afternoon. She thought of how tired she was of being afraid. 6 months, she said quietly. 6 months, Alexander agreed. And when it ends, I walk away with enough money to keep this shop and never worry about debt again. You have my word, he said. She writing, if you wish, signed before witnesses. Evelyn exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the decision settle over her like a second storm, quieter than the one outside but just as powerful. This was not a choice she wanted to make. It was a choice that circumstances had forced into her hands, the way circumstances so often did to people who had already lost everything once. There will be rules, she said. I will not lie to your staff about my past. I will not pretend affection I do not feel in private. And the moment this becomes something I cannot bear, I walk away, money or no money. Agreed, Alexander said, and for the first time since he had entered the shop, something like relief crossed his face. Evelyn studied him one more time, this stranger who had walked in from a storm carrying an offer that could save her life or destroy it. She did not yet know which. Thank you, he said softly. You have no idea what this means. She almost smiled, though there was no joy in it, only the grim determination of someone stepping off a cliff because the ground behind her had already crumbled away. Do not thank me yet, she said. We have not even begun. Outside, the thunder rolled again, closer this time, as if the sky itself understood that something had just changed, quietly and irreversibly, in the small bookshop where a widow had just agreed to become a duchess for 6 months, and neither of them yet knew how much that pretending would eventually cost, or how much it would eventually give. Alexander offered his hand, not to shake, but simply to help her prepare for what came next. Tomorrow morning, he said, a carriage will come for you at 9. Bring only what you need. Everything else will be provided. Evelyn nodded, though her chest felt tight with the enormity of what she had just agreed to. As he turned to leave, disappearing back into the rain as suddenly as he had appeared, she stood alone in her shop, surrounded by the books that had been her only companions for 2 long years, and wondered what kind of world she was about to step into, and whether she would recognize herself when she came out the other side of it. The carriage arrived exactly at 9, its black wheels splashing through puddles left by the night storm, and Evelyn stood at her shop window watching it approach with a strange mixture of dread and disbelief. She had barely slept. She had packed a single bag, unsure what a duchess, even a pretend one, was supposed to bring into a new life. The coachman, a quiet older man named Samuel, helped her inside without a single question about who she was or why a bookshop owner was being collected in a ducal carriage. Evelyn understood, within the first few minutes of the ride, that discretion was going to be a constant companion in this new arrangement. Winslow Manor appeared through the trees like something out of a painting, its stone towers rising against a pale morning sky, gardens stretching in every direction, more land than Evelyn had ever imagined belonging to a single family. Her stomach twisted as the carriage rolled up the long drive. She had told herself she was prepared. She was not. Alexander was waiting at the entrance, dressed properly now, none of the desperate rain-soaked man from the night before visible in his composed expression. Beside him stood a woman with silver hair and sharp, curious eyes, leaning slightly on a cane, watching the carriage with the intensity of someone who had waited a long time for this moment. That is my grandmother, Alexander said quietly as Evelyn stepped down. The Duchess Margaret, please, whatever nerves you feel, do not let them show. Evelyn straightened her spine and walked forward, extending a hand that trembled only slightly. Your Grace, she said, it is an honor to finally meet you. Margaret studied her for a long moment, her gaze moving from Evelyn's plain traveling dress to her steady eyes, missing nothing. Alexander has told me almost nothing about you, she said, her voice thin but not weak, which tells me he is either very private or very nervous. Which is it, my boy? Both, Alexander admitted, and for the first time Evelyn saw a flicker of real affection pass between grandmother and grandson, something that made the entire deception feel heavier and more complicated than she had expected. Margaret turned back to Evelyn. Walk with me, dear. I want to know the woman who finally caught my grandson's attention. Evelyn shot Alexander a brief, panicked glance, but he only nodded, a silent reassurance that offered little actual comfort. She fell into step beside the Duchess as they moved slowly through the entrance hall, past portraits of ancestors staring down from gilded frames, past a staircase wide enough to fit her entire shop. Tell me how you met, Margaret said. Evelyn's mind raced. Alexander had given her almost no details overnight. No shared story, no rehearsed history. She thought quickly. It was at a charity event, she said, choosing her words with care. I was donating books for a fundraiser. He offered to carry a box that was far too heavy for me to lift alone, and then he refused to leave until I agreed to have tea with him. Margaret's lips curved into the first genuine smile Evelyn had seen from her. That does sound like him, she said. The stubborn. Always has been, since he was a boy who would not leave a stray dog alone until it trusted him. Evelyn felt a small measure of relief, though she knew this was only the first of what would surely be countless questions designed to test the truth of her story. Over the following days, Evelyn learned the rhythms of the house the way one learns a foreign language, slowly and with frequent mistakes. She learned which fork belonged to which course, though on the second evening she still reached for the wrong one, and had to catch herself under Margaret's watchful eye. She learned the names of the staff, from the head housekeeper, Mrs. Ellison, to the young footman named William, who always seemed eager to help her find her way through the maze of hallways. She learned that Alexander took his coffee black in the mornings and preferred silence for the first hour of the day, a detail she absorbed simply by watching him rather than being told. The hardest part was not the etiquette or the unfamiliar rooms. The hardest part was learning to perform closeness with a man she barely knew, in front of an audience that watched for any sign of hesitation. At dinner, Margaret would ask Alexander to pass Evelyn the salt, instead of asking Evelyn directly, forcing small moments of contact between them, testing whether their hands would brush naturally or awkwardly. In the evenings, Margaret insisted they sit together in the drawing room, Alexander reading while Evelyn worked on needlework. She barely knew how to hold properly. The Duchess watching from her chair by the fire, with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world and none of it at all. One evening, nearly 2 weeks into the arrangement, Margaret announced that a small dinner party would be held the following week, with several families from neighboring estates invited to meet the new Duchess. Evelyn felt her chest tighten the moment she heard the news. A dinner party, she repeated. With guests, people who will ask questions I have not prepared answers for. Alexander found her later that night in the library, pacing between the shelves with an expression of quiet panic that mirrored the very first night they had met. You will be fine, he said, closing the door softly behind him. I will not be fine, she said. I do not know your family history. I do not know your childhood. I do not know a single detail that a real wife would know without thinking. What if someone asks where we honeymooned? What if someone asks the name of your favorite childhood pet? I cannot invent an entire life in 1 week, Alexander. Then let us build one together, he said, pulling a chair close to hers and sitting down. Ask me anything. Tomorrow. Ask me again. We will do this every evening until the details feel less like facts and more like memories. And so they began, each evening after supper, sitting together in the library, while Alexander told her about his childhood summers at the coast, about the horse he had loved as a boy named Apple, about the year his parents had died in a carriage accident when he was only 12, leaving Margaret to raise him alone. Evelyn listened, sometimes forgetting entirely that this was meant to be preparation for a performance, caught instead in the simple pleasure of hearing another person's history unfold. In return, she told him about Daniel, about the bookshop they had built together from nothing, about the illness that had taken him so quickly there had barely been time to say goodbye. Alexander listened without interrupting, without offering the hollow comfort so many people offered grieving widows, simply sitting with the weight of her loss the way a true friend might. By the night of the dinner party, Evelyn felt more prepared than she had expected, though her nerves still hummed beneath her calm exterior, as she dressed in a gown Margaret had insisted on providing, deep green silk that made her feel like an entirely different woman than the one who had stood behind a bookshop counter only weeks before. The guests arrived in a steady stream of carriages, lords and ladies whose names Evelyn had memorized from a list Alexander had prepared, each one greeted with practiced warmth, despite the anxiety twisting inside her. The evening moved smoothly at first, conversation flowing easily around topics of weather and local news, until a sharp-voiced woman named Lady Beatrice turned the conversation directly toward Evelyn. Tell me, Mrs. Winslow, she said, using the name Evelyn had not yet grown accustomed to hearing applied to herself, how does a woman with no family connections come to capture the attention of a duke? Surely there is an interesting story there. The table quieted, several guests leaning forward with poorly concealed curiosity. Evelyn felt Alexander's hand find hers beneath the table, a small anchor of reassurance. There is a story, Evelyn said, keeping her voice light and steady, though it is a simple one. I was not looking to capture anyone's attention. I was donating books to a charity fundraiser, focused entirely on getting through a heavy box without dropping it, when a stubborn man insisted on helping me whether I wanted his help or not. Laughter rippled around the table, breaking the tension. Alexander smiled, adding his own detail about how he had nearly dropped the box himself, turning the story into something warm and believable, and Evelyn felt, for the first time, that perhaps this deception was not as fragile as she had feared. But not every moment of the evening passed so easily. Near the head of the table sat a man Evelyn had not yet been introduced to, Edmund Winslow, Alexander's cousin, watching the exchange with narrowed eyes and a smile that did not reach them. He said little throughout dinner, but Evelyn noticed him observing everything, the way Alexander's hand lingered near hers, the way Margaret watched them both with obvious hope, the way Evelyn herself occasionally hesitated before answering a question about her supposed past. After dinner, as guests mingled in the drawing room, Edmund approached Evelyn while Alexander was occupied elsewhere. "Quite the whirlwind romance," Edmund said, his tone pleasant but his eyes calculating. "Alexander has never been one for spontaneous attachments. It makes a man curious what changed." "People change when they meet the right person," Evelyn said carefully. "Or when they need something," Edmund replied, his smile sharpening slightly. "Margaret's health has been declining for months. Her doctors do not expect her to see another winter. It would be quite convenient, would it not, for a sudden marriage to appear right when the family fortune is about to be reconsidered?" Evelyn's heart pounded, though she kept her expression composed. "I do not know anything about family fortunes, Mr. Winslow," she said. "I only know my own life, and I am simply living it." Edmund's smile lingered a moment longer before he excused himself to speak with other guests, leaving Evelyn standing alone with a cold unease settling in her stomach. She found Alexander later, near the edge of the garden where he had stepped out for a breath of night air. "Your cousin does not trust me," she said. "My cousin trusts no one," Alexander replied, though his jaw tightened at the mention of Edmund. "He stands to inherit a significant portion of the estate if I die without an heir, or if my marriage is ever proven false. He has watched my life closely for years, waiting for any misstep. Then he suspects," Evelyn said. "He suspects everything," Alexander said. "It does not mean he knows anything. We simply must be careful, and convincing, for as long as this arrangement lasts." Evelyn looked out over the moonlit garden, feeling the fragile nature of their agreement more sharply than she had since the night it began. She had thought the greatest danger would be Margaret's sharp questions, or her own unfamiliarity with this strange new world. She had not considered that someone might be actively hunting for cracks in the story, waiting for the moment it would all fall apart. As the weeks continued, Evelyn found herself growing more comfortable in the manner, more skilled at the small performances required of her, more familiar with the rhythms of Alexander's days and Margaret's moods. She began to genuinely enjoy her evenings in the library, the stories that flowed easily between them now, no longer rehearsed facts but something closer to real conversation. Margaret's health, however, seemed to worsen with each passing week, her cough deepening, her walks growing shorter, her naps growing longer. One afternoon, Evelyn found Margaret sitting alone in the garden, staring at nothing in particular, an expression of quiet sadness on her face that Evelyn rarely saw the older woman allow herself. "Your Grace," Evelyn said gently, sitting beside her. "Is something troubling you?" Margaret turned to her with a small, tired smile. "I am simply thinking about how little time I seem to have left, and how much I still want to see," she said. "I want to see Alexander truly happy, not just married, but happy, the way his parents were before they were taken from him too soon. I want to know that when I am gone, he will not be alone in this enormous house with nothing but portraits and memories for company." Evelyn felt something tighten painfully in her chest, guilt threading through the sympathy she felt for the dying woman beside her. "He will not be alone," she said softly, and in that moment, she almost believed it herself. Margaret reached over and took Evelyn's hand, her grip surprisingly firm for someone so frail. "Thank you for coming into his life," she said. "I do not know exactly how it happened, but I am grateful every single day that it did." Evelyn could not find words to respond, caught between the lie she had agreed to and the very real tenderness that had grown, unexpectedly, and without her permission, inside her heart. She simply squeezed Margaret's hand and sat with her in the garden as the afternoon light softened around them, aware that whatever this arrangement had started as, it was becoming something far more complicated than either she or Alexander had ever intended. The horses reared without warning, their screams cutting through the quiet afternoon as the carriage lurched violently to one side. Evelyn grabbed the doorframe just as the wheel struck a hidden hole in the road, throwing her hard against the window. Outside, Alexander shouted something she could not hear over the panic of the animals, and for one terrifying moment, the entire carriage tilted, threatening to overturn completely, before Samuel managed to pull the horses back under control. When the carriage finally settled, Alexander was already at the door, wrenching it open with hands that shook far more than the situation seemed to require. "Evelyn," he said, his voice raw. "Evelyn, look at me. Are you hurt?" "I am fine," she said, though her own hands trembled as she accepted his help climbing down. A little shaken, nothing more. Alexander did not let go of her hand once she was standing. He studied her face, her arms, as though searching for some hidden injury she might be hiding from him, his expression carrying a depth of fear that seemed far beyond what the situation called for. "Alexander," she said gently, "I am truly fine." He exhaled slowly, and only then did he release the tight grip he had kept on her hand, though he did not step back. "For a moment I thought," he began, then stopped himself, running a hand through his hair instead of finishing the sentence. "Thought what?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment before answering, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. "I thought I was about to lose you," he said, "and it frightened me more than anything has frightened me in a very long time." Evelyn's heart stumbled over itself. She wanted to remind him, and perhaps remind herself as well, that this was an arrangement, that fear like this was not supposed to exist between two people playing a part for an audience of one dying grandmother. But the words would not come, because something in his eyes told her the fear he felt was not performance at all. Samuel repaired the wheel enough for them to continue slowly back to the manor, and the ride home passed in a silence that felt different from their usual comfortable quiet, charged instead with something neither of them dared to name. That evening, Margaret noticed immediately that something had shifted between them, though she said nothing beyond a knowing glance over dinner. Later, when Evelyn retired to her room, she found herself unable to sleep, replaying the moment Alexander had gripped her hand, the raw fear in his voice, the way he had looked at her as though she were something precious rather than simply useful. She was still awake near midnight when a soft knock came at her door. Alexander stood in the hallway, still dressed, clearly no more able to sleep than she was. "May I come in?" he asked, "only to talk. I find I cannot rest until I say something." Evelyn stepped aside to let him enter, and he sat near the window while she remained standing, an unspoken agreement between them that whatever was said tonight required a certain careful distance. "I owe you an explanation," he said, "for how I reacted today." "You do not owe me anything," she said. "We were both frightened. It was a dangerous moment." "It was more than that," he said, looking down at his hands. "Evelyn, when this began, I told myself, and I told you, that this was simply an arrangement. Money for your shop in exchange for a performance to comfort my grandmother. I believed that was the whole of it. But somewhere between the library conversations and the dinner parties and the quiet mornings, I stopped thinking of this as a performance at all." Evelyn's breath caught. "Alexander," she started, but he raised a hand gently, not to silence her, but to ask for the chance to finish. "I am not asking you to feel the same way," he said. "I understand this began under circumstances that gave you very little real choice, and I would never want you to feel pressured to return feelings simply because I have developed them. I only wanted to be honest with you, because you deserve honesty, even inside a lie as large as the one we are living." Evelyn sat down slowly across from him, her heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with the carriage accident. "I do not know what I feel," she admitted quietly. "I have spent 2 years believing that part of my heart died with Daniel, that I owed it to his memory to never feel this way again. But lately, Alexander, I find myself looking forward to the evenings in the library more than I look forward to anything else in my day. I find myself wondering about you long after we have said goodnight." Alexander looked up at her, something hopeful flickering behind the caution in his eyes. "That is not nothing," he said softly. "No," she agreed. "It is not nothing." Neither of them moved to close the distance between them that night, both too aware of the fragile nature of their situation, the watching eyes of the household, the ticking clock of Margaret's health, the looming shadow of Edmund's suspicion. But something had shifted permanently in the room, an honesty that neither of them could take back, and when Alexander finally rose to leave, he paused at the door and turned back to her. "Thank you," he said, "for not pretending you felt nothing, even if you are not certain what you do feel." After he left, Evelyn sat by her window for a long while, watching the moon move slowly across the garden, feeling the strange mixture of fear and hope that comes with realizing a lie has grown a true heart inside it. The following weeks brought changes Evelyn had not expected. Margaret's health continued its slow decline, though she insisted on joining Evelyn and Alexander for meals whenever her strength allowed, watching the two of them with an expression that had shifted from testing curiosity to something closer to quiet, satisfied hope. Edmund, meanwhile, seemed to sense the change as well, his visits to the manor growing more frequent, his questions sharper, his presence a persistent shadow at the edges of every gathering. One afternoon, while Alexander was away attending to estate business in the village, Edmund found Evelyn alone in the garden, tending to the roses Margaret had taught her to care for over the past weeks. "You have settled in well," he said, approaching without invitation. "Remarkably well, for a woman who apparently met my cousin only months ago." Evelyn did not look up from the roses. "Thank you," she said simply, refusing to give him the reaction he seemed to be searching for. "I spoke with an old acquaintance last week," Edmund continued, his voice light but his eyes watchful. "A woman who used to frequent a certain bookshop in town. She mentioned a widow who ran the shop, a woman named Hart, who closed her doors rather suddenly a few months ago. Quite the coincidence, is it not, that a bookshop owner named Hart should share both a name and a sudden disappearance with the new Duchess of Winslow?" Evelyn's hands stilled on the roses, though she forced herself to remain calm. "Many people share names, Mr. Winslow," she said, "and many shops close for many reasons." "Perhaps," Edmund said, stepping closer. "But I find myself curious about the reasons behind this particular closure, and I intend to keep asking questions until I understand them fully. I would advise you, Mrs. Winslow, to consider carefully what happens when the truth surfaces, as truth so often does, no matter how carefully it has been buried." "Is that a threat?" Evelyn asked, finally meeting his gaze directly. "It is a warning," Edmund said, his smile cold. "I have no personal quarrel with you, but I have watched my cousin's inheritance for a very long time, and I will not stand by quietly while a stranger threatens to take what should rightfully come to me, whether through a fraudulent marriage or otherwise." He left without waiting for a response, his footsteps crunching against the garden path as he walked away, leaving Evelyn standing among the roses with her heart pounding, and her mind racing through every possible way this discovery could unravel everything she and Alexander had built. When Alexander returned that evening, she told him everything, watching his expression darken with each word. "He is closer to the truth than we can afford," Alexander said, pacing the length of the library while Evelyn sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "If Edmund proves this marriage is not what it appears to be, he will not simply expose us quietly. He will use it publicly, in the most damaging way possible, to secure his claim on the estate, and destroy whatever good this arrangement has done for my grandmother's peace of mind." "What do we do?" Evelyn asked. Alexander stopped pacing and looked at her, his expression a mixture of determination and something softer underneath it. "We hold firm," he said. "We give him nothing to confirm his suspicions, and we hope that whatever time remains is enough for my grandmother to find the peace she has been searching for, before Edmund finds whatever proof he believes he needs." "But what if he does find it?" Evelyn pressed. "What happens to us then?" Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I do not know," he admitted finally, "but I know that whatever happens, I do not regret a single moment of the time we have spent together, arrangement or not." Evelyn felt tears sting unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, the weight of everything, the fear, the growing feeling she could no longer deny, the constant threat of Edmund's suspicion, pressing down on her all at once. Alexander crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "I know this began as something practical, something built entirely on necessity," he said softly. "But Evelyn, somewhere along the way, it stopped being practical for me. I find myself hoping, foolishly perhaps, that when these 6 months end, you will not simply walk away with your payment and disappear from my life entirely." Evelyn looked down at their joined hands, feeling the warmth of his fingers around hers, feeling the fragile hope blooming in her chest, despite every reason she had to guard against it. "I do not know what the future holds," she said honestly, "but I know that I am no longer counting down the days until this arrangement ends the way I was when it began." That admission seemed to settle something between them, a quiet understanding that whatever label their relationship deserved, it had long since stopped being purely transactional. But even as they sat together in the warm glow of the library fire, the shadow of Edmund's threat lingered at the edges of Evelyn's mind, a reminder that happiness built on a foundation of deception could crumble at any moment, and that the coming weeks would test everything they had built far more severely than any dinner party or carriage accident ever had. That night, unable to sleep, Evelyn walked the halls of the manor and found Margaret still awake, sitting by her window with a cup of tea slowly going cold beside her. "You should be resting, Your Grace," Evelyn said gently, entering the room. "Sleep does not come easily anymore," Margaret said, gesturing for Evelyn to sit beside her. "Tell me, dear, are you happy here?" Evelyn hesitated, unsure how much of the truth she could safely share. "I am happier than I expected to be," she said carefully. Margaret smiled, a knowing, gentle expression that made Evelyn's chest tighten with unspoken guilt. "That is a careful answer," Margaret said, "but I will take it. for now. I have lived a long life, Evelyn, long enough to recognize real affection when I see it growing between two people, even when they themselves are still learning to trust it. Evelyn said nothing, uncertain how to respond to words that felt uncomfortably close to seeing through the very lie she and Alexander had built their entire arrangement upon. Margaret reached over and patted her hand gently, the gesture warm and undemanding. "Whatever secrets you and my grandson are keeping," Margaret said softly, "I suspect they matter far less than what has grown between you despite them. Do not let fear of the truth destroy something that has become real, dear. That would be the greatest tragedy of all." Evelyn left Margaret's room that night with those words echoing in her mind, unsure whether the Duchess had simply offered gentle wisdom or had, in fact, seen through the entire deception from the very beginning. Either way, the words settled into her heart with a weight she could not shake, a quiet reminder that time was running short, for Margaret's health, for the fragile secret she and Alexander were protecting, and for the growing feelings neither of them could continue to deny much longer. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, sealed with Edmund's personal crest, and the moment Alexander broke it open and read the contents, Evelyn watched the color drain completely from his face. "What is it?" she asked, setting down her tea. "He knows everything," Alexander said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "He has found the landlord who handled the eviction notice on your shop. He has a signed statement confirming the timeline, showing that our marriage occurred within days of you facing the loss of your business. He intends to present this evidence at the summer ball next week, in front of every important family in the county." Evelyn's stomach dropped. "The summer ball," she repeated. "The one your grandmother has been looking forward to for months." "The very same," Alexander said grimly. "Edmund has chosen his moment carefully. He knows that exposing us privately would allow us time to prepare a defense. Exposing us publicly, in front of witnesses who matter, gives us no room to control the narrative at all." Evelyn sank into a chair, her mind racing through every possible consequence. If the truth came out publicly, Margaret's final months would be shattered by betrayal rather than filled with the peace Alexander had hoped to give her. Evelyn's own reputation would be destroyed beyond repair, and whatever fragile, growing love existed between herself and Alexander would be buried under scandal before either of them had the chance to see where it might lead. "We have to tell her ourselves," Evelyn said suddenly. "Before Edmund has the chance to twist the story into something ugly, your grandmother deserves to hear the truth from us, gently, rather than from your cousin's cruelty in front of an audience." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the weight of the decision. "It will break her heart," he said softly. "She has been so happy these past months, Evelyn. She believes, truly believes, that I have finally found love, that she can leave this world knowing I will not be alone. Then let us find a way to tell her that is not entirely false," Evelyn said, reaching for his hand. "Because Alexander, whatever this began as, I do not think either of us can call it entirely a lie anymore." Alexander looked at her, something raw and hopeful passing across his features despite the crisis unfolding around them. "No," he agreed quietly. "I do not think we can either." That afternoon, they went together to Margaret's room, finding her resting by the window with a book open on her lap that she had not been strong enough to actually read in weeks. She looked up as they entered, and something in their expressions must have told her immediately that this was not an ordinary visit. "Sit down, both of you," she said, her voice gentle despite the seriousness in the room. "Tell me what has happened." Alexander began slowly, choosing his words with obvious care, explaining the circumstances of the arrangement from the very beginning. The desperate proposal in the rain-soaked bookshop, the 6-month agreement, the money offered in exchange for Evelyn's participation. Margaret listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable, her eyes moving occasionally between her grandson and the woman she had grown to love as though she were truly family. When Alexander finished, silence stretched through the room, heavy and uncertain. Evelyn braced herself for anger, for the devastating heartbreak of a dying woman learning her final months had been built on deception. Instead, Margaret began to laugh, softly at first, then with something close to genuine amusement, though tears gathered in her eyes even as she laughed. "Your Grace," Evelyn began, uncertain how to interpret the reaction. "Oh, my dears," Margaret said, wiping at her eyes. "I have known since the very first week." Both Evelyn and Alexander stared at her in stunned silence. "You knew," Alexander finally managed. "Of course I knew," Margaret said, her voice warm, despite the frailty underneath it. "Alexander, you have never in your entire life managed to lie to me convincingly, not since you were 6 years old and tried to convince me a vase had broken itself. I saw the way you looked at each other that first morning, careful and rehearsed, Nothing like two people who had shared years of marriage. I knew within days that whatever story you had constructed was not the truth. Then why? Evelyn asked, her voice trembling with confusion. Why did you allow this to continue? Why did you never say anything? Because, Margaret said, reaching for both their hands. I watched something happen that I had not expected. I watched a careful, guarded performance slowly become something real. I watched my grandson learn to laugh again, truly laugh, for the first time since his parents died. I watched a grieving widow learn to hope again, to care about roses and gardens and evening conversations instead of simply surviving one day at a time. I did not want to interrupt whatever was growing between you, even if it began under false pretenses. Some of the truest things in life begin as accidents, my dears. I suspect this may be one of them. Evelyn felt tears spill freely down her cheeks, overwhelmed by relief and something deeper, a profound gratitude toward the woman who had seen through their deception and chosen grace over anger. But your grace, Alexander said, his voice tight with renewed worry. Edmund knows as well. He intends to expose us publicly at the summer ball. Whatever peace you have found in believing this arrangement genuine will be shattered in front of the entire county. Margaret's expression sharpened, the frailty in her eyes replaced momentarily by something fierce and determined. Then we will simply have to make certain that what Edmund exposes is no longer a lie, she said. Tell me, Alexander, and be honest with your own grandmother, if with no one else in this world, do you love this woman, truly, beyond the arrangement that first brought her into this house? Alexander turned to Evelyn, his eyes steady despite the vulnerability evident in them. Yes, he said simply, I love her. Margaret turned her sharp gaze to Evelyn next. And you, dear, what does your heart tell you, when you set aside the fear and the arrangement and simply ask yourself the truth? Evelyn looked at Alexander, at the man who had walked into her shop soaked from a storm, desperate and honest even in his desperation, who had listened to her grief without flinching, who had feared for her safety with a depth that had nothing to do with performance, who had chosen honesty with his own dying grandmother over protecting a comfortable lie. I love him too, Evelyn said, the words leaving her chest like a weight finally set down after being carried too long. I did not expect to. I did not want to. Not after Daniel. Not after believing that part of my heart had closed forever. But it is true. I love him. Margaret smiled, a full and radiant smile despite the tiredness in her face. Then Edmund's exposure will accomplish nothing, she said, except to reveal a love story rather than destroy one. Let him bring his evidence to the summer ball. Let him try to turn truth into scandal. We will meet him with honesty instead of shame, and honesty, my dears, is far harder to attack than a carefully guarded secret. The week that followed passed in a blur of preparation, both practical and emotional. Evelyn and Alexander spent their evenings together, not rehearsing false details any longer, but simply being together. The pretense finally dissolved into something neither of them needed to perform. Margaret, despite her declining strength, insisted on being present for every planning conversation, her sharp mind still fully engaged in strategy even as her body grew weaker by the day. The night of the summer ball arrived with a tension that hung over Winslow Manor like a held breath. The ballroom filled with the same important families who had attended the earlier dinner party, chandeliers blazing overhead, music filling the air with a cheerfulness that felt almost mocking given the confrontation everyone present did not yet know was coming. Edmund arrived precisely on time, dressed impeccably, a folder of documents tucked beneath his arm, his expression carrying the satisfied confidence of a man certain of his victory. He waited, Evelyn noticed, until the ballroom was fullest, until the moment would carry maximum impact, before he made his move. Ladies and gentlemen, Edmund announced, his voice cutting through the music and conversation with practiced authority. I have an announcement that concerns the integrity of this family, and I believe every person here deserves to hear the truth. The room fell silent, all eyes turning toward him, then toward Alexander and Evelyn standing together near the head of the hall. Edmund opened his folder, holding up the signed statement from Evelyn's former landlord, describing in cold, deliberate detail the timeline of the eviction notice, the sudden marriage, the convenient financial arrangement that had followed. Gasps rippled through the crowd, whispers spreading like fire through dry grass, exactly the reaction Edmund had clearly hoped to provoke. Alexander stepped forward before the whispers could grow into something uncontrollable, his voice calm and steady despite the storm Edmund had unleashed. Edmund is correct, he said, and the room fell into stunned silence at the unexpected admission. This marriage did not begin the way marriages typically do. It began as an arrangement, born of desperation on my part and necessity on hers. The whispers returned, sharper now, scandalized. Edmund's smile widened, certain his victory was complete. But, Alexander continued, raising his voice slightly to be heard over the rising murmur, what Edmund does not know, what he could not have discovered in his careful investigation, is what that arrangement became. He does not know that I have fallen completely and irreversibly in love with this woman standing beside me. He does not know that she has come to love me in return, not for my title, not for my fortune, but for who I am when the title and fortune are set aside entirely. The room quieted again, curiosity replacing scandal on many faces. My grandmother has known the truth from nearly the beginning, Alexander continued, gesturing toward Margaret, who sat in a chair near the front of the gathering, her expression proud and unwavering despite her frailty. She chose grace over exposure because she recognized something true, growing inside something that began false. I am asking each of you tonight to extend the same grace. What began as pretense has become the realest thing in my life, and I will not allow my cousin's ambition for an inheritance he does not deserve to destroy it. Edmund's confident expression faltered, his careful plan crumbling under the weight of Alexander's public honesty. He had prepared for denial, for panic, for scandal that would isolate the couple in shame. He had not prepared for a confession delivered with such calm, unshakable conviction. This changes nothing about the legality of the situation, Edmund said, his voice losing some of its earlier authority. A marriage born of financial convenience is still a marriage born of deception, regardless of what feelings may have developed afterward. Perhaps, Margaret said, rising slowly to her feet with the help of her cane, her voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom. But tell me, Edmund, since when has this family, or any family in this room, required every marriage to begin with a grand romantic gesture rather than practical necessity? How many unions in our own history began as arrangements between families, only to grow into genuine partnership over time? My grandson's marriage began unconventionally. I will not deny that. But it has grown into something real, something I have witnessed with my own eyes, and something I give my full blessing, publicly, in front of every person gathered here tonight. The room, which had swayed uncertainly between scandal and sympathy throughout the confrontation, seemed to settle firmly onto Margaret's side, murmurs of approval replacing the earlier gasps of judgment. Edmund looked around at the shifting mood, his careful plan unraveling completely in front of witnesses who had come expecting scandal and were leaving instead with a story of unexpected love. This is not finished, Edmund said quietly, though the fight had visibly gone out of his voice, before turning and leaving the ballroom without another word, his documents still clutched uselessly in his hand. Evelyn turned to Alexander as the music slowly resumed around them. The crisis passed, the truth finally spoken aloud without destroying everything they had built. You did not have to admit all of that in front of everyone, she said softly. Yes, he said, taking her hands in his. I did. Because you deserve a love that does not hide in shadows. Evelyn, whatever this began as, I want the rest of it to be lived honestly, in the open, with nothing left to fear from the truth. Evelyn felt tears gathering again, though these carried none of the fear from earlier that day, only a fragile, overwhelming hope for whatever came next. The knock at Evelyn's door came just past dawn, urgent and insistent, pulling her from sleep with a jolt of instant fear. Mrs. Ellison stood in the hallway, her face pale, her hands twisting anxiously in front of her apron. It is the Duchess, she said. She is asking for you and the Duke. Please, come quickly. Evelyn threw a robe over her nightgown and ran, her bare feet cold against the stone floors, her heart pounding with a dread she recognized from the day she had lost Daniel, a dread that whispered she was about to lose someone else she had come to love. Alexander was already ahead of her, having been roused moments earlier, and they reached Margaret's room together, breathless and afraid. Margaret lay propped against her pillows, her breathing shallow, but her eyes clear and alert, fixed on the two of them the moment they entered. A doctor stood quietly near the window, his expression carrying the gentle, practiced sorrow of a man who had delivered this particular news many times before. Grandmother, Alexander said, rushing to her bedside and taking her frail hand in his. Do not look so frightened, my boy, Margaret said, her voice weaker than it had been even the night before, though still carrying its familiar warmth. I have had a good, long life, and I intend to leave it exactly the way I wish to, surrounded by the people I love most, having witnessed the very thing I prayed for before I went. Evelyn moved to the other side of the bed, taking Margaret's other hand, tears already gathering though she fought to keep her voice steady for the older woman's sake. Your Grace, she began. Hush, dear, Margaret said gently, though there was no unkindness in it. Let an old woman speak while she still has breath enough to say what matters. Evelyn, I want you to know that meeting you was the greatest unexpected gift of my final year. I have watched you transform from a frightened stranger, reciting rehearsed answers, into a woman who belongs in this family as surely as if you had been born into it. You gave my grandson back his heart, and you gave me back my hope, and there is no debt of money or arrangement that could ever repay what that has meant to me. Evelyn could not hold back her tears any longer, letting them fall freely as she pressed a kiss to Margaret's frail hand. Alexander, Margaret continued, turning to her grandson, promise me you will not let fear or grief close your heart the way it nearly did after your parents were taken. Promise me you will let yourself be loved, fully and without reservation, for the rest of whatever years you are given. I promise, Alexander said, his voice breaking despite his effort to remain steady. And Evelyn, Margaret said, her eyes growing heavier even as she fought to keep them open, promise me you will let go of whatever guilt you still carry. About Daniel, about beginning this arrangement dishonestly. You have nothing left to atone for. You gave an old woman peace, and you gave a lonely man love. And that is nothing to feel sorrow over. I promise, Evelyn whispered. Margaret's eyes drifted closed, a small, contented smile settling over her features, her breathing growing slower and quieter, until it finally, gently, stopped altogether, her hand still resting warmly between theirs. The doctor stepped forward quietly to confirm what both Alexander and Evelyn already understood, though the confirmation did nothing to soften the grief that settled heavily over the room. They stayed beside her for a long while after, neither speaking, simply holding on to each other and onto the memory of a woman who had seen through their deception from the very beginning, and chosen, with remarkable grace, to nurture the truth growing underneath it, instead of exposing the lie. The funeral, held 1 week later, drew mourners from across the county, the same families who had witnessed Alexander's public confession at the summer ball, now gathering to honor the woman whose wisdom and warmth had touched so many lives. Edmund attended as well, standing at the edge of the gathering, his earlier ambitions seeming smaller and more hollow in the shadow of genuine grief shared by everyone else present. He approached Alexander briefly after the service, his expression uncharacteristically subdued. She was a remarkable woman, Edmund said quietly, an admission that carried no trace of his earlier scheming. Whatever quarrel existed between us, I never doubted that. Thank you, Alexander said, and though the two men would likely never share genuine warmth between them, something in Edmund's posture suggested the fight had permanently left him, his earlier ambitions buried alongside the woman who had outmaneuvered him with nothing more than honesty and grace. In the months that followed, Winslow Manor slowly found its rhythm again, grief settling into something quieter and more manageable, the ache of Margaret's absence softened by the presence of the love she had lived to witness. Evelyn used a portion of the money Alexander had originally promised to expand her bookshop into a small community library, open to anyone, regardless of their ability to pay, a tribute to the woman who had taught her that generosity given freely returned tenfold. Alexander, meanwhile, began the slow work of repairing the estate's relationship with Edmund, not out of forgiveness exactly, but out of a genuine desire to honor his grandmother's belief that family, however complicated, deserved the chance to heal. One crisp autumn morning, nearly a year after the storm that had first brought them together, Alexander led Evelyn out to the garden Margaret had loved so dearly, now bursting with the last roses of the season. He knelt before her among the flowers, producing a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, and asked Evelyn to marry him again, properly this time, with nothing false or arranged about the promise between them. We are already married, Evelyn said, laughing through sudden tears, though her heart was already saying yes before her mind had fully caught up. Not like this, Alexander said, his own eyes bright with emotion. I want to marry you because I choose you, freely and completely, with no storm forcing my hand, and no arrangement dictating the terms. I want the whole county to witness a wedding built entirely on love, so that when our own grandchildren someday ask how we met, we can tell them the truth of what we became, even if we choose to keep certain details of how it began just between us. Evelyn pulled him up from the ground and kissed him there among the roses, the autumn sunlight warm on their faces, the garden alive with the quiet, persistent beauty Margaret had cultivated throughout her long life. Yes, Evelyn said, yes, 1,000 times yes. Their second wedding, held in the very ballroom where Edmund's exposure had once threatened everything, filled with genuine joy rather than careful performance. The same families who had witnessed the scandal now witnessing its resolution into something entirely real. Evelyn wore her own gown this time, chosen freely rather than provided, and Alexander watched her walk toward him with an expression of open, unguarded happiness that would have been impossible for either of them to fake on that very first desperate night in the rain-soaked bookshop. As they exchanged vows before family, friends, and the memory of the woman who had made this moment possible through her wisdom and grace, Evelyn thought of Daniel, of the love she had once believed could never be replaced, and found, for the first time, that loving Alexander did not diminish what she had shared with her first husband, but simply proved that hearts, however broken, remain capable of healing and growing again. After the ceremony, as guests celebrated late into the evening, Alexander pulled Evelyn aside for a quiet moment near the garden, away from the noise and music. "Do you remember what you said to me, that very first night?" he asked. "Do not thank me yet, we have not even begun." Evelyn smiled, remembering the fear and uncertainty of that stormy evening, so different from the peace she felt now. "I remember," she said. "Well," Alexander said, pulling her close, "I believe we have finally begun." And in standing together in the garden his grandmother had loved, surrounded by roses that bloomed each year as a quiet testament to patience and grace, Evelyn Hart, once a grieving widow certain her heart had closed forever, and Alexander Winslow, once a desperate duke pretending at a happiness he did not believe he deserved, finally allowed themselves to simply be exactly what they had become, not a performance, not an arrangement, simply, completely, and irreversibly, in love.